you're going to be looking at increasing that demand dramatically. But is it going to happen overnight? No. It's going to be a slow process in terms of both those areas, power generation and transportation. But what you're going to start seeing are some of the adoption curves come into play. And, some of those adoption curves are pretty standard. Start looking at SUVs, 7 years to hit 12% of the penetration of the market. Well, you're going to start seeing some of that. But the influencers of that, first of all, is the economics, second is the environmental. So you start looking at electricity regulations coming out in Canada, or you start looking at EPA regulations coming out of the U.S. All of those will be factors tying into how fast or how slow the adoption curves. Clearly, it was pointed out that in terms of looking at power generation, the economics are very good for looking at peak with natural gas these days. You're going to start seeing more and more of that. Clearly looking at manufacturing, and one of their costs are power, utilities. Well, again, I think that the economics are there to have natural gas supplant some of the coal-fired generation plant. But it's not the only. And I think you've got to look at continuums, because as you start looking at Ontario, you have nuclear, you have wind, you have solar. But I think, more and more people are saying, well, maybe natural gas needs to have a larger role. And I think you'll start seeing some of that play out.
In terms of regulations, what could be done on a provincial or federal level to encourage this to happen?
Well, clearly on the federal level, I think the electricity regulation that was proposed in the Gazette, looking at the retirement of coal-fired generation plants, is a move in the right direction. It's really mitigating the CO2 levels, whereas in the U.S. you're starting to look at more detailed work in terms of NOx, SOx, particulate, which I think is very, very important, particularly from the health benefits. And I also think that when you start looking at what we need to do for society, and I think, in the U.S., clearly the Clean Air Act was a huge mover in jurisdictions across America that really had pushed the fact that there needed to be a bridge, and natural gas is filling it.
I want to talk a little bit about the issue of exports of LNG, and there seems to be a big debate now regarding the issue of sort of this oil-linked price versus the prices we've seen in the U.S. for exports, and maybe why are you seeing Asians, for example, where they're now typically paying among the highest prices in the world, are they being more aggressive in terms of bargaining for much lower prices? Who gets a bigger chunk of that price differential in the arbitration around the world? Is that something that you're seeing that's happening?
Well, I think fundamentally what you have to look at is that there is a difference in regards to culture. And when you start looking at the Asian markets, and certainly in my former role as president of educational institution, we did a lot of work in China and in the Middle East, but certainly in China, you're starting to look at the long-term view. Whereas North American I would characterize as more a short-term view. And because of the long-term view in Asia, they're starting to look at what do they need in the longer term, and that's why the investments that you're starting to see in the marketplace, both here and in the U.S., are starting to pick up on the fact that they have a high demand. They see that high demand increasing in the future. You just have to point to some of the numbers in the middle income earners in China growing at a phenomenal rate, and as a result they want more energy components to it, and I think that that's playing out. When they start looking at some of the modifications in terms of their economic growth, 8% is still very good, and so again I think that 8% in regards to the China market is still great economics for us to look at the export side. And again, the numbers, in North America, we need to be looking at what those numbers represent. And it's huge growth, certainly from the export of LNG. And I think you're going to see that play out in a number of ways.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.